Right, it's the Hawk. Quick, let me speak or you'll knock off my beat. The Dungeon of Doom were weird, but were they to be feared? We're going to find out in today's video, which was a Patreon request by Q Branch. If you want to make the Hawk talk, sign up today. Now, Kevin Sullivan, the leader of the Dungeon of Doom, had already been battling Hulkamania, but things really took a strange turn at Slamboree 1995. Sullivan had just won a match when he was interrupted by a morbidly obese man covered in cobwebs, and seemingly he was stuck in a chair. This was the the master. He told Kevin Sullivan he was the Taskmaster. This led to a series of bizarre pre-records of these two meeting in a medieval dungeon. Also, Sullivan running through woods trying to find the master. I almost can't believe this watching it back. Sullivan was lacking in confidence and believed nobody could actually defeat Hogan. The master told Sullivan he would need to lead a Dungeon of Doom against Hulkamania to kill it, because it was etched in stone. Sullivan was terrified of the master, but regained his confidence after running through a door and embracing his new Taskmaster character. This whole thing was extremely jarring. It felt like Doctor Who from the 70s. The master introduced the first wrestler joining the group. He was billed as being from under the sea as comical music from Jaws played. This is the Shark, the former Avalanche John Tenter. He was quickly followed by another wrestler, the Zodiac. This was Ed Leslie in a bizarre gimmick where he could only say yes or no. Man, these segments hurt my head. Kamala would also be in the group. And finally, the Giant. This was the original Dungeon of Doom, and the Giant was their great hope to destroy Hulkamania. The Big Show back then was presented as being the son of Andre the Giant, and was out for revenge for his father. These bizarre segments in the dungeon were a regular TV fixture. What a bunch of wacky people. Interestingly, before the Dungeon of Doom, Sullivan had been going after Hulkamania with the Shark and the Zodiac, but none of this was mentioned. They were under different characters then. It really did feel dated even by 1995. They all look strange, they all act strange, and by golly they be strange. So the group's entire purpose would be to end Hulkamania. Within a couple of months, a segment aired where Hogan had been transported into the dungeon. Hogan's acting is so silly here and comedic, even though it's not supposed to be. Hogan meets the biggest threat to Hulkamania, the Giant, who choked him out, but nothing else happened. You morons, you wanted to end Hulkamania, you literally had him in your dungeon and you didn't try to murder him. This is the man who gives these morons a whole purpose to exist, and yet they did nothing. There was a really cringy segment at Clash of Champions where the Giant once again choked out Hogan in the dungeon before Van Vader came to Hogan's rescue. Man, for a secretive magical dungeon it sure seems like anybody could just wander in when they feel like it. The Doom members mostly just won pointless squash matches for a while. Sullivan apparently had some sort of mythical power which he used to control the cast of wacky characters, and he forces them to do the dungeon's bidding. For no reason whatsoever, the dungeon introduced a new member, Meng. Sullivan was concerned that his powers wouldn't be strong enough to control the man called Meng. He needn't worry, he did nothing in the group. The Dungeon of Doom fired their first shot when the Giant crushed Hogan's Harley Davidson using a monster truck. This all would come to a head at Full Brawl 1995. They would face the Hulkamaniacs in a War Games matchup. The match is boring and Hogan's team wins it with a camel clutch. Because Hogan wins, it means he gets 5 minutes alone in the cage with Kevin Sullivan to extract some revenge. After beating him up for a while, the Giant wearily makes the save. He certainly wasn't in any sort of rush to save the man who controls him. At this point, this dungeon crap is all over the WCW show. It feels incredibly dated. If I was a person watching at the time, I sure would have changed the channel. Admittedly, whilst most of the dungeon's members were useless and couldn't be taken serious, the Giant was booked to look like a dangerous threat, at least at first, as he cut through the WCW roster with ease. Hogan was so injured by the Giant, so at least he's looking somewhat of a threat. If things weren't bizarre enough already, Sullivan decided to dress up as an old lady and attack Hogan from the crowd using a walking stick. But they weren't finished there, because the Dungeon of Doom shaved off Hogan's iconic mustache. I'm actually surprised Hogan was okay with that. Quite a big moment in this storyline. At the same time, the Giant continues destroying the entire roster. You can't really knock the build up to this feud. Unfortunately, it's going to take a terrible turn though. But first, Hogan actually embraces a darker side and ditches the red and yellow. It's a strange period of about a month which most people forget happened. Hogan rants against Andre and his son the Giant for ages. They're interrupted by the Dungeon of Doom driving a monster truck, but they're barred from the building. For some reason, the decision is made that before they have an actual match, they must first have a monster car battle on top of a building. This was certainly a strange turn of events. Not sure why it was necessary. Concerned that the Giant would lose the match with Hogan, they decided to debut a new member, Again, it just wasn't necessary. There was already enough people in this group who were barely getting TV time as it was. An episode of Nitro ended with a fake block of ice and what looked like a mummy breaking out of it. On to Halloween Havoc and the monster truck battle. The trucks are welded together and we have to sit and watch the trucks pushing backwards and forwards. You struggle to stay awake as the minutes tick by. Eventually, Hogan wins the monster truck battle. They both climb out the cabs and now they fight. It ends with Hogan pushing the giant off a freaking skyscraper, so now he's dead. Of course, this puts the main event into doubt because the giant fell off a building. But no, he then just walks out for his match like nothing happened. It doesn't make any sense and it kills the whole storyline. And Hogan looks like a 90-year-old woman without his mustache. We get a terrible slow main event between the Giant and Hogan. Hogan has this match won, but his manager Jimmy Hart turns heel on him. Luger and Savage do come to Hogan's aid. Then, one of the worst moments in WCW history, is the Yeti, a mummy who was supposed to be even bigger than the Giant due to lifts in his shoes. There's an awkward double bear hug spot. Lex Luger also turns on Hogan, and then the mummy walks around the ring like an idiot. Did we really need another 2 bodies in this faction? This important main event is thrown out for DQ. Hogan was DQ'd, I guess, because Jimmy Hart was his manager who attacked the ref. A complete mess, but it was about to get messier. The next episode of Nitro, Jimmy Hart revealed that he had messed up Hogan's contract and inserted with Hogan's contract and inserted a clause that he was actually able to lose the belt through a DQ. And just like that, the Giant is now the WCW champion. What a great way to capture your first belt. 2 weeks later, Jimmy Hart was unfortunately informed that the changes he made to Hogan's contract would not be allowed, and the belt was vacated. What a waste of time. These events seemingly caused Hogan to completely lose the plot as he dressed up as Batman and whatever this promo here was supposed to be.
You know something, Hulkamaniacs? The darkness in the Dungeon of Doom shakes in fear just because Hulk Hogan is walking around with the power of the training, the prayers, and the vitamins. The Macho Man is on a mission. He's gonna bring us the head of Ming.
It was a strange time for Hogan. It was almost like he was briefly a tweener. To demonstrate that, Hogan had a match against the Stinger and he comes through the crowd and jumps Sting from behind to loud boos. The boos had been slowly creeping in as the weeks went by, but this time the boos just could not be ignored. It's rumoured that Eric Bischoff was using this time as a brief test to see if he could work out as a heel. The trial only lasted around a month and he was soon back to the red and yellow, but for a brief time it seemed like the Dungeon of Doom had actually accomplished their mission of destroying Hulkamania. Lex Luger kind of took up the second most important spot in the Dungeon of Doom as he feuded with the Macho Man. Everybody else is just pointless, they're barely on the show and they don't even turn up for Sullivan's promos. Why do we need Jimmy Hart and Sullivan? Aren't they both the mouthpieces? And Jimmy Hart doesn't even look like he fits into this damn faction. It wasn't even properly explained why he joined them in the first place. Anyway, they weren't too upset about the Giant losing the title because they were confident that he was going to win an upcoming Battle Royal with the belt on the line. Sullivan and Hart are all over the show at this point and it's unbearable. Meng being in the dungeon felt almost completely pointless, although it would seem like a sensible inclusion in the first place, but for some reason he was hardly ever with the dungeon, he was just managed by Sullivan. We arrived at the World War III Battle Royal. The Yeti is still called the Yeti, but for some reason he's no longer a mummy, he's now a ninja. This was never explained. And he's literally the first man to be eliminated in about 10 seconds. Despite the dungeon's confidence, the Giant doesn't actually win this match, because Randy Savage does. The next storyline they have is just a sort of tug of war over Lex Luger. Is he with the Dungeon of Doom or his friend Sting? This caused dissension amongst the dungeon. It wasn't very compelling, and Luger played along with both sides for ages before ultimately not being in the Dungeon of Doom. It was around this time that the dungeon added some new members. Hugh Morris, who wasn't particularly strange looking, but his personality was. Big Bubba, aka the Big Boss Man. The Barbarian, One Man Gang, and Loch Ness. Most of these additions would be pointless and barely showed up on the main show. The Dungeon of Doom had turned Hogan into a more violent individual and he was placed on probation for beating the crap out of everybody with a steel chair. Towards the end of 1995, the Master left WCW, so no more weird creepy promos in the dungeon. At least he can spend time washing those cobwebs off of him now. The Zodiac got a bit of character development when he started randomly showing lots of care for the Giant's well-being. He continually tried to stop the Giant from fighting with Hogan. An alliance was formed between the Dungeon of Doom and the Four Horsemen. It was called the Alliance to End Hulkamania. Kevin Sullivan looks like a short, fat version of Hogan in a nappy. Sorry, it's just a random observation that popped into my hawk head. Super Brawl 6 would be a pretty notable pay-per-view for the Dungeon of Doom. One Man Gang failed to regain his US title. Yeah, somebody in the dungeon actually had a belt. Not for long though. Horrible match too. He just dropped that belt to Conad. He's not the Conad we all came to know and love. Sullivan was involved in a really strange match with Brian Pillman called a I Respect You strap match. It went about 30 seconds with Pillman grabbing the mic and saying, I respect you, Booker Man. Sullivan was indeed the Booker Man, and Pillman was fired, as far as everyone was concerned. Arn Anderson tried to have the match with Sullivan before Flair reminded them that they were both supposed to be in an alliance which ended Hulkamania. Yeah, it's not going very well. They're fighting each other instead. Also in this show, the Giant and Hogan had another match, this time in a cage. Yet again, it's not the most exciting match. Hogan wins, he no-sells Kevin Sullivan's chair shot. They all head back into the cage and Hogan proceeds to fight off 7 men all by himself. It's an incredibly ridiculous visual. The entire faction is destroyed by Hogan on his own until Loch Ness strolls down the ramp. He sprays bad breath around for a bit, but ultimately the Dungeon of Doom don't even let him get in the cage with Hogan. Wow, this faction sucks. It's well established that Loch Ness aka Giant Haystacks was in horrible health at this time, and he was at least 10 years past his prime. Somehow things got even worse for the dungeon when one man once again fought off the entire dungeon in an effort to protect Hogan. At the time he was a mystery man, but it was revealed that this man was actually the Zodiac, who was now the Booty Man. He'd actually been a spy the whole time sent by Hogan. I mean, it doesn't really make any sense given some of the stuff we saw. Whatever, never mind, it's not like he's a relevant character anyway. The Dungeon of Doom was mostly phased out and forgotten, with more focus being on the Alliance. As they were badly losing the battle, they decided to add another couple of guys. Z-Gangster and the Final Solution. Well, at least they looked like they belonged in a Kevin Sullivan faction. At Uncensored, the Giant, who had become distracted from ending Hulkamania, was feuding with Loch Ness over who was the biggest man in WCW. They had a horrible short match, which the Giant won. In the main event, they had a Doomsday Cage match putting the Mega Powers against the Alliance to end Hulkamania. Another horrible match, although it's sort of entertaining for how much of a unique visual it is. The Mega Powers win, because they always do. At this point, Kevin Sullivan seemingly gives up on ending Hulkamania and heads into feud with Chris Benoit. I heard that these two were the greatest of friends. Wow, this feud is actually good. It's better than anything that a Dungeon of Doom did the entire time. Benoit and Sullivan were feuding because Woman, who was Sullivan's wife, started a storyline where she left him for Chris Benoit. This would lead to the two falling in love for real, and her actually leaving Sullivan for real. Great job, Booker Man. The NWO angle started up a few months after this, which thankfully put a stop to the Dungeon of Doom nonsense being the main WCW angle, as the Giant and Big Bubba both joined the NWO. More so the Giant, because him leaving the Dungeon of Doom meant they were left without a main eventer. The Dungeon of Doom still existed for a surprising amount of time, but it was never really the main focus of the show ever again. They mostly wrestled in 8-man tags down on the lower card. Times had sure changed, and it just didn't fit into the new edgy Attitude Era. The Dungeon of Doom were mostly on C shows, and their recruitment policy just became bizarre at this point. They added Sergeant Buddy Lee Parker as a leprechaun, which surely had to be a rib. I mean, he is pretty short, and he does have a bad temper. It was only for a show, but it was sure ridiculous. Max Muscle wasn't going to help them move up the card, and Conad being in this group seems like some kind of weird fever dream. Sullivan's time in WCW came to an end in 1997 after he lost a retirement match to Chris Benoit after his then manager Jacqueline cost him a match. The Dungeon of Doom never did end Hulkamania because Hulkamania ended itself when the NWO was formed. The whole point in the group was literally just to feed Hogan opponents, and he could beat them all down with ease. It helped that Hogan was working with a lot of guys that he trusted and had a friendship for. It's just a shame that nobody other than possibly the Giant had any benefit whatsoever from being part of this faction. For a group that had around 20 different members over the course of its existence, you would have wanted somebody else to have succeeded here. So the Dungeon of Doom has to go down as a massive fail. Plus, the first 6 months of its existence were unbearable with all the bizarre pre-tape shots in the dungeon with the Master. It felt like a decade removed from the Attitude Era, when in reality it was just a few years away. And I don't want to dump on Kevin Sullivan, because I know that he is a well-respected mind within the business, but I think he just looked incredibly dated too, and he brought down the aesthetic of the show. I can also understand why the fans started booing Hogan around this time. With this being the main storyline in WCW, there just wasn't much to like about anybody involved with this. After the main storyline ended, we were just left with a random group of lower carders who didn't do a whole lot of note, but somehow they stuck around for another 8 months after the Uncensored cage match, doing nothing. So I guess the Dungeon of Doom will go down as a sort of precursor to the Ministry of Darkness. The Ministry essentially did the exact same thing, but made it edgy and cool. The Dungeon wasn't cool, and if you don't agree with that, I'll take your girl and make her drool.